I wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. Kedoshim is one of those parshiot that no matter where one casts their eye, we see something that begs to be explored. And having had the blessing of doing this for a few years, I visited Kedoshim formally a few times. But this year, one verse leapt off the page to me, and I thought, let's sit with it for a while, or at least just a few minutes. It is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 28. V'seret lanefesh lo titnu bivsarchem, uchtovet ka'aka lo titnu bachem, ani Adonai. It's page 699 in the Chumash, if you still have it. You shall not make gashes in your flesh for the dead, or incise any marks on yourselves. I am Adonai. Easy to skip past it, perhaps, but it's a verse that I spend an inordinate amount of time with in my week in and week out blessing of working as a Jewish officiant. Every time I walk with a family as they bring a loved one to their final resting place, I think about this verse, and I marvel again at the honesty and wisdom of traditional Jewish mourning rituals. I have the merit of serving on the rotating clergy call list for Eden Cemetery in Los Angeles. And because I've lived in LA a number of years, have enough connections, as it were, that I'm occasionally called on to work with a family that otherwise does not have a rabbinic presence in their lives. So very often I will meet a family that does not have formal Jewish affiliation, and yet having faced the reality of a loved one's passing, sometimes suddenly they need the comfort and the structure of Jewish ritual. And among those rituals is the Kriah ceremony, or the cutting ceremony. Different rabbis do it at different times in the order of the service, but I always conduct it quietly before the main service begins. Part of that is because that's where it appears in the conservative rabbinic manual. That's where it's placed in the order of things. But I find that that moment is the most appropriate and pregnant with possibility to do that cutting ceremony. Unfortunately, many of us have experienced it more than one time, or even more than a few times, more than we'd care to remember. But at that moment, the closest relatives of the deceased stand together. I invite them to support one another physically in a private and intimate circle. They recite the brief prayer that acknowledges Dayan Ha'emet, the judge of truth, and affirm that, in the words from the book of Job, chapter 1, Adonai has given and Adonai has taken. Praised is the name of Adonai. And then in a gesture of inexpressible profundity, the mourners tear a small black ribbon that is affixed to their clothing close to the heart. And in parts of the Jewish world, Kriah, or cutting, is still done on an article of clothing, which is then worn during Shiva, the first and almost always most intense period of grief. The tearing of black ribbons, which some also wear, changing from one item of clothing to the other throughout Shiva, the first 7 days, is a more recent development. But the practice of rending the garments goes back to some of our oldest biblical stories. For instance, Job, which may predate the Bible, in that chapter 1, and King David in 2 Samuel chapter 13. They both honor the mitzvah in this week's portion. They don't make any cuttings in their flesh for the dead, and instead they are described as tearing their clothing upon receiving unthinkable news. Why does the Torah need to include such a prohibition? Well, mourning practices in parts of the world, including the ancient Near East, often included gashing of the skin and permanent self-mutilation, even reports of self-blinding of at least of one eye. I actually first encountered that when reading James Michener's Hawaii, which I imagine a number of you have read. In it, the traditional peoples on the islands, when their great matriarch would die, particularly the matriarch's spouse or partner, he would blind himself in one eye and make permanent gashes on the skin. So for the rest of his life, he would be seen as having been in mourning for his ali'i nui, the great tribal matriarch. The Levitical prohibition responds to that impetus. It may still be done in a few remote places, I don't know. But the Torah begs us to not release the terrible pain of loss and emotional torment by hurting our divinely created bodies, particularly at a time when a loved one's body is about to leave the earth. The Holiness Code, as this remarkable portion is known, offers so many prescriptions for living in ways that are mindful, respectful, and full of care, which I always try to think of when I hear the word careful, which sounds like I need to be timid, but in fact, full of care. Now, not all of the commandments apply to our time and sensibilities, as you noticed, but so many are still so relevant and necessary. Some are far more famous, as we noted, such as love your neighbor as yourself. Do not put a stumbling block before the blind. Do not mix wool and linen or sow different kinds of seed in your field and using two different animals. And of course, the one that is quoted so widely at this time as well, in addition to love your neighbor as yourself, is do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, and so many others. But something about the mitzvah of how we are not to mourn seems especially poignant to me for how it led to the Kriah ritual that is still with us today. And many people who have had no Jewish affiliation formally until that moment of burying a loved one find that when I offer them to tear the black ribbons, I've only had maybe one person who didn't wish to do it, and others who thought for a long moment and then ultimately said, yes, we do want to do that. I'm not even sure that they themselves at that moment know why they're saying yes. The Torah forbade cutting one's skin as a demonstration of visible grief, but our ancestors respected and preserved the impetus to tear something. They seemed to know, in their wisdom and compassion, that at that moment, the act of tearing something would be essential and necessary. The Yiddish word for funeral is levaya, and it comes from the words to escort or accompany, which is exactly what we do at that august ceremony, both for the dead and for the living. Since a levaya is often one of the few formal Jewish rituals in which people actually take a personal part, every moment should leave a lasting and meaningful impression if it's done artfully. And Kriah does that. The physical motions of holding and ripping the cloth provide something sanctioned to do at a time that can be utterly bewildering and frightening. We tear the cloth or the ribbon as if to say, we are being torn from one chapter of our lives to the next. The departed one has been torn away from us, and even if their lives were full and they drew their final breaths surrounded by love and free of pain, we tear the cloth. It can't be made whole again, and by doing so we say we accept that life will never be the same, without that loved one in our world. The act of Kriah is a cathartic one. It opens the floodgates of emotions that may have been held in check, and it gives permission for tears and words to flow. And then the sight of the torn ribbon or item of clothing worn near the beating heart of the surviving mourner is what the early rabbis called a megale et libo, a revealing of the heart that is broken in grief. It is a silent but immensely potent announcement of loss, which can then open the channels for support and comfort from friends and the community. I am amazed continually by the creativity and resilience of the Jewish people. Our sages, Moses, rejected the earlier and physically destructive mourning ritual, but retained the therapeutic benefit and multi-layered symbolism of tearing a piece of cloth. It is yet another way that Judaism reaffirms its commitment to life and living, even as we look with honesty and courage at the ultimate emet, the ultimate truth. This commandment reminds us to be moderate in our grief, to not squelch it, to not deny it, but to not hurt ourselves in the process, tempting as that might be. This commandment appears in the Holiness Code, and that cannot be accidental. Every mitzvah in this parsha, we can make an argument for why our ancestors felt it was a prescription for kedusha, for sanctity, for deepening our connection to the divine. Kriah is a unique portal to holiness because once it is done, the levaya can proceed and the mourners can officially recite Kaddish, the formula whose name means holy. Kaddish pulls mourners to their feet to stand before the God of all and praise the holy name. And it's what we promise to do at the start of that ceremony with the words from Job. God has given and God has taken. Praised be the name of the Creator. When perhaps that is the very last thing that we want to do, tearing the ribbons or the cloth opens the floodgates for praise. With those words from Job and the rising for Kaddish, we gently close the circle of holiness that ought to rightfully embrace both the deceased and the mourners. The remainder of the verse is, "Do not incise any marks on yourselves." That's, of course, been generally associated with the prohibition against tattooing, which post-Holocaust has so many other layers of meaning. But even in very observant, particularly Sephardic circles, there are temporary, beautiful designs that can be made on the body with natural henna to celebrate a glorious moment. Or in my case, to celebrate the reopening of the Renaissance Fair after 2 years of being closed, and after the henna artists really had a very tough year, 2 years, without the formal events and art fairs that they usually would ply much of their trade at. So though we have these two prohibitions in this tiny little mitzvah here, there's still room for moderation, for things done in the right time, for the right reason, and things that aren't permanent. Because in the end, nothing is, except for the refrain of this parsha, Ani Adonai, I am the Lord. May our hearts be open to holiness. May all who mourn be comforted. And may we have so many opportunities to celebrate, to hold one another in strength and in peace and in blessing. Shabbat Shalom.